So we're going to take a look at the Korean War of the early 1950s in two parts, with a little activity in between. Uh, I'm not sure if any of you have seen the Korean War Memorial down in Washington, D.C. That's the photograph on the title slide, and it's obviously very different from the great memorial of World War II, the Iwo Jima flag raising. You look at those soldiers, and you don't get a sense of victory and glory, because the Korean War was not a victory. It was officially a draw, and it still is, even though we don't talk about it much. Officially, the Korean War is still going on to this day, which is why the Korean Peninsula is such a dangerous place. After World War II, as was true in many places, areas were divided between occupation forces of the Soviet Union and occupation forces of the United States. Korea had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II. We took it away from them, and once these two different countries with their two different economic and political systems occupied the North and the South, it was clear that we were not going to have one Korea but two. And again, that persists to this day. The country was divided pretty much 50-50 along the 38th parallel. But by the end of the 1940s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had withdrawn their forces. But there were some other things that happened that year that raised the level of tensions. The big one was that on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, announced the birth of the People's Republic in China, in Beijing. The Chinese Communists had won the Chinese Civil War, the side that we had been supporting, not with troops, but with military aid. The nationalists, the Kuomintang, had lost. And while many of the Kuomintang remained in China to be, I guess you could say, re-educated, thousands fled to the island off the coast of China called Taiwan and set up a new government there. They called themselves China. The communists called themselves China. Both countries proclaimed to the world that there was only one China. Take your pick. You can't recognize both of us. We obviously recognized Taiwan as China. This will become more crucial later on in the war. But you can see where the Korean Peninsula is. It hangs off the southern part of Manchuria. So it's right there, right in the middle of all of this. There were tensions in Korea in the 1940s between North and South. There was like a border war of skirmishing that was going on. It was a little bit of a pain for us. We actually refused to supply South Korea with the weapons that they were asking for, because we were afraid they were going to take those weapons, like tanks, and invade North Korea and create a war that we were going to have to respond to. So we just gave them defensive weapons, which they needed, because on June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. And despite the fact that there were no American troops right there, despite the fact that we had given some indication that Korea was not particularly important to us, this clearly was a violation of the 1947 Truman Doctrine. And so President Truman decided immediately that the United States was going to defend South Korea. He ordered Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the reconstruction of Japan, to get as many American troops from occupation duty in Japan over into South Korea as quickly as he could. But we did something else. We took this issue to the United Nations. And the United Nations voted in the Security Council to condemn the actions of North Korea, to order their withdrawal, and when they did not withdraw, to authorize a United Nations war against North Korea. This was the first of what to this day is still only two wars authorized by the United Nations. The second one was the 1990-1991 Gulf War. But the arrival of American troops and then eventually troops from other United Nations countries did not really stem the tide of the North Korean assault. The United Nations also proclaimed that the United States, since it was providing most of the troops to the defense of South Korea, would pick the leader of the United Nations forces, and obviously that was going to be Douglas MacArthur. A couple months after the initial assault of the North Koreans, their forces had pushed the South Korean army and the United Nations forces back into a tiny corner of the Korean Peninsula. And if you look at that right-hand map, you see that darkened area around the port of Busan. That's essentially all that's left of South Korea at this point. Now, we're not going to settle for that. And we established a pretty strong defensive perimeter around the port of Busan, and we began flooding that port with more troops and more material. And then clearly it was just a matter of time before the United States was going to organize a breakout maneuver. And this is something we did do. It was perhaps Douglas MacArthur's finest moment as a general, because it was carried off with incredible efficiency. We loaded tons of troops onto landing craft, snuck them around the southwestern part of the Korean Peninsula, and landed at the port of Incheon. That was in September of 1950. And almost immediately, the war turned completely around. And as quickly as the North Koreans had flooded into the south, the United Nations forces, led by the United States, flooded into the north. We went back to the United Nations, asked for authority to reunite the two parts of the Korean Peninsula into one country, thinking that that would be the only way we could avoid future war. The United Nations authorized that, and that was our goal. However, on the other side of North Korea, across the Yalu River, lies China, communist China. And we were a little bit concerned about what they might do in the event of a reunited Korea that was not communist. So President Truman flew out to Wake Island in the Pacific and met with MacArthur, explained his concerns, and ordered him, as his commander-in-chief, to, one, not violate Chinese airspace with the United States Air Force flying any types of missions into northern China, despite the fact that a lot of material and support for the North Koreans was coming from China. And two, do not send American troops anywhere close to the Yalu River. I mean, the Chinese forces on the other side of the river had been for centuries looking across the river and seeing Koreans. And if they looked across the river and saw American soldiers, they might anticipate that we were about to invade them. MacArthur saluted, said, "Yes, sir," and then almost immediately violated both of those directives. We did have American planes going into China, and we sent American troops right up to the river. So, not surprisingly, at the end of November, a couple 100,000 Chinese troops entered the war, and then the war shifted again. It was like a yo-yo, this war, back and forth, up and down that peninsula. So now it's the Chinese who are represented by those red arrows. And we were getting out of North Korea as quickly as we could. MacArthur was not particularly disappointed, because now he thought we could do what he had hoped we'd be doing the whole time. Just let's go to war with China. So he recommended 3 actions. 1, blockade the coast of China. Obviously, naval blockade is an act of war. 2, bomb with the Air Force the bases in Manchuria that were supporting the Chinese war effort inside of Korea. Again, an act of war. And 3, while he didn't recommend having the United States invade mainland China, he wanted the Navy to have the nationalist Chinese, the Kuomintang, from Taiwan, invade mainland China, with the idea being that they would re-enter China, and with our support, our blockade and our air support, they could topple the communists and restore their rule in China. clearly what MacArthur was suggesting would have begun some type of World War III, and President Truman was not interested. So I don't think he used those exact words there, but that is essentially the message he got to MacArthur. And thus, in our first shooting war, our first hot war of the Cold War, the world, the American people, were introduced to something new, something called limited war. And what was limited war? Well, limited war was war with limits on just about everything. One, we would not be using all of our troops in this war. Many of American military leaders were convinced that this war was actually a distraction of the communist world, that if we transferred troops from Western Europe into the Korean conflict, that the Soviet Union will all of a sudden invade Western Europe. So we were not going to use all of our troops to fight the Chinese in Korea. The homeland of our enemy, and our main enemy now was China, was off limits. We could shoot Chinese soldiers if they were in Korea. As soon as they went back across the Yalu River, they were off limits. We could not bomb China. We could not attack China. Okay? It was a weird situation, but those were the new rules. We were not going to transform American life the way we did during World War II. There was no rationing. We did not order factories to convert to wartime production. We did not have parades to raise money and war bond drives, anything like that, because we were afraid that if we changed American life in the way that we changed it during World War II, the American people would grow frustrated and ask, well, why don't we just end the war in a way that we know that we can end a war, which meant the bomb. And this is maybe some evidence that Truman had some regrets about ending the last war with the bomb, because he didn't want to end this war with the bomb. So no, we weren't going to just rev up the American people into war fever, because that could result in them demanding something that we did not want to do. And yes, we were not going to use all of our weapons. And finally, we were not pressing for victory. We began negotiating with the Chinese, and essentially, at this point, we were playing for a tie. And of all the people in the United States, actually it wasn't in the United States, but all the American people, no one was more frustrated with the idea of playing for a tie than Douglas MacArthur. Okay, well, generals in the Army have been frustrated with their commander-in-chief throughout American history, no more so than Abraham Lincoln for much of the Civil War. But you have to salute and follow orders. That wasn't MacArthur's style. He had a fairly sizable ego. He wrote a letter to a Republican congressman, knowing very well that this Republican congressman was going to read the letter out loud in Congress, a letter that criticized Truman and that ended with those words, "There is no substitute for victory." Now, you could say, well, he's allowed to do that, freedom of speech, First Amendment, all of that. Yes, but he is publicly criticizing his commander-in-chief. And the military has a word for that. It's called insubordination. And even though MacArthur had a brilliant war record and was one of the most popular military leaders in the country, Truman dismissed him. And there are the words in his telegram. As the newspapers reported it, he fired MacArthur and ordered him back home. Tremendous controversy ensued, and that's what we're going to deal with now.